I'm Barbara R. Walters, Professor of Sociology at the City University of New York. This brief vodcast is one in a series on sociological theorizing. Here, we move past the basic steps of theorizing in the early discovery phase, as noted by Swedberg, to incorporate two important terms that may be familiar from Introduction to Sociology, that is, the sociological imagination and standpoint. My friend and erstwhile colleague, Joseph Ugoretz from Colley Honors College, began the semester in spring of 2021 with some quotes, a letter, and then some quotes from a passage from Tolkien's The Fellowship of the Ring, and whose quotes of despair about the historical period in which we and they were placed. Says Frodo, "I wish it need not have happened in my time." "So do I," said Gandalf, "and so do all who live to see such times." Note, this was before COVID and all of the other events of 2020. To recap from where we left off, sociological theorizing means learning to frame meaningful questions that can be answered with empirical data and plausible explanations for empirical patterns that can be corroborated with social science research methods. From Swedberg, remember the basic steps of theorizing in that early discovery phase, where we begin with observing and choosing something to investigate, naming and formulating the central concept, and then building out the theory and completing the tentative theory to include an explanation. In Swedberg and others, the 2x2 or fourfold table is a central cognitive piece for theorizing. Again, recapping from the earlier lecture, here we have job, status, and pay by men and women, and the theory is not true or it's not correct in all times and all places, but it provides a foothold for empirical hypothesizing that allows us to frame questions that can be answered with data. In this brief podcast, now beginning with Mills, he elaborates on the idea of the fourfold table, here with an illustration of the definition of class from Max Weber, which includes class or economic status or the amount of deference a position is entitled to or receives, and power, or the ability to get people to do things when they don't want to do them. Again, we start here, and I'll come back to this table at the end of the lecture. Another big piece in this course, or this section of Foundations of Sociological Theory, in addition to the focus on theorizing, here women and minorities are no longer in the margins of the course. They're fully integrated into the course, and that full integration includes Dorothy Smith, Cynthia Epstein, Kimberly K. Huang, and Black theorists such as W.E.B. Du Bois, William Wilson, and Elijah Anderson. Another important piece in this course, which you can find in the slides reviewing Introduction to Sociology, we have moved away from this two or dual picture of levels of sociological analysis to include the global level, the macro level, which is societal, the meso level, which is organizational, and then the micro level, which is face-to-face interaction. A central concept in the sociological imagination by C. Wright Mills, which most undergraduates read in their Introduction to Sociology course. A key distinction is that between personal troubles, which occur within the character of the individual and the range of his or her immediate relations with others. Those limited areas of social life with which he or she is intimately familiar or personally aware, and public issues, which have to do with issues that transcend these very local environments of the individual and the range of his or her inner life. They have to do with the organization of institutions in history more generally. One note here about Mills as you read him. Mills always uses the masculine pronoun. So as you're reading Mills, it may drive you batty, but he always stays in the masculine pronoun. This was 1950s, before second wave feminism and before the awareness of sociologists of how to modify and use language, which is much more gender inclusive. Much more generally, Mills was a part of the generation following World War II and the changing post-World War II class structure in America was key to his sociological ideas and understanding. He expanded in his theory to the idea of bureaucracy, because bureaucracies, the concept of Weber, was becoming more and more a part of American life. He also expanded the idea of consumerism, which became more and more a part of everyday life for Americans in these later stages of capitalism, or whatever your bias, the free enterprise system. The new middle class emerged in this. Managers, salaried professionals, advertising executives, and office workers became a new strata within the class system in between what was then, to a certain extent, the owners of the means of production and workers. But as we'll see later on, even the idea of owners of the means of production has so dramatically transformed. We are in a totally different world. But now we have the personality market, and in the 1950s and through the 1960s, what developed was what is called a personality market, marketing to personalities, but also the focus of much of Mills's work was on the managerial man, or the political indifference, what Mills called the organization man, the desire on the part of people to move up in the organization and therefore to kind of accept orders and directives coming down from management and to execute those with the hope of moving up and becoming a manager themselves. Another aspect of this society that emerged after World War II, and again, this is around the 50s and the 60s, was a kind of powerlessness and passivity of the middle and working classes. If you drive through Long Island, but you could do this in anywhere in America, you'll see tracts and tracts of housing that looks pretty similar. And this was, at the time, the American dream. Owning your own home, having a job, having your children in school, having a family. These were part and parcel of what Americans wanted during that historical period. Many people were unaware of and unable to resist the power of the power elite. They weren't even aware that such a thing existed. And then the whole idea of mass education, or the implementation of mass education, often produced a mass political indifference or kind of apathy. The masses became more interested in consumption, buying things at the department store, and entertainment, like going to the movies, than in politics. I should add here on both of these slides both the organization of organizational man and emphasis on man, and in the mass society. In the organizational man, people wanted to fit in. They wanted to be part of it. And the same, to a certain extent, became true in these little suburban villages. People wanted to be good neighbors. They wanted to have friends. They wanted to not rock the boat. In the appendix to the sociological imagination called on intellectual craftsmanship, you will begin to see, I only assigned you a few pages, just a few pages of that, but you begin to see something that looks more familiar to you or might look more familiar to you. Here, at the beginning of it, all written in the masculine, as though the only person reading it is the young, aspiring male sociologist. But here, Mills talks about his note-taking activities, his keeping files and indexes. This is all before the computerization of note-taking, but the way in which he organized and filed his notes. But he began his empirical analysis of the power elite or upper circles. He had already looked at the working class and the middle classes. So here now in the power elite, he's looking at the upper circles. He identified, expanding on Weber. Weber had class, status, and power in his understanding of class. That is, class sources an amount of income, status, the amount of deference, power, the realization of one's will, even if others resist, and now occupation, or the activities for which one is paid. These dimensions of social class were expanded considerably throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s to include education, neighborhood, and a wide variety of other nuances to create dimensions of the American class system. So the next step for Mills in theorizing, after he took all these notes and created the dimensions of social class, he created a table of all of the variables, although here he doesn't have occupation. He has class, these are Weber's variables, class, plus or minus, then status, plus or minus, that's this row right here, plus high status, low status, and he has operational definitions for these in those very few pages to which you were assigned in the intellectual craftsmanship, and then power, plus or minus, again, empirical operational definitions in the actual article. So Mills, alongside other empirical sociologists at Columbia University, launched the sociology, modern sociology, as it was known and understood for several decades, all the way up through, at least to a certain extent, even up to the present. Although now we have much more sophisticated ways of both doing qualitative sociological work and quantitative sociological work through computerization. As an old-fashioned sociologist, from my point of view, nothing substitutes for the eyewitness as a starting point, even if that eyewitness comes from detailed qualitative interviews. So the second piece of this new way of theorizing and the new way of presenting sociological theory is the incorporation of previously marginalized sociologists, not as asides in the course, but as individual sociologists who contributed significantly to the way we think about the whole sociological enterprise today. I begin here with Dorothy Smith, who was a feminist. And for Dorothy Smith, the rules of sociology, this ethos of objectivity that was part and parcel of the empirical scientific inquiries such as C. Wright Mills, separates knowledge from everyday lives and everyday experience. These predefined conceptual frameworks define what is relevant and what is not. If one took this further, one could begin to say that the concepts themselves frame and limit what you can actually see in an empirical observation. According to Smith, sociology was written and practiced from the standpoint of men, and thus they legislate through the imposition of concepts, a reality, rather than discovering a reality through observation. This framework or reality that has been built up through sociological theories omits and excludes many people's experienced realities, what later became to be known as lived experience. For Smith, a key idea is knowing from within which challenges the positivist view of sociological objectivity. Now, Smith takes us a little too far in the subjective direction, because she says the only way of knowing a social reality is to know it from within, how it is experienced by the people who live it. This is dicey. I mean, we don't have to experience it ourselves, but we do have to, Weber had this in his Sociology Verstehen, we do have to understand and see it from the point of view of the people who live it. So sociological inquiry is necessarily a social relationship. You cannot separate sociological knowledge and sociological practitioners from the realities of the lives studied in some kind of epistemological terms. This means that our cognitive capacities are always intertwined with our subjects. For Dorothy Smith and others in the generation of the second wave feminists, myself included, we began to discover that men and women not only inhabit and move in different social worlds, and to write about it, but that men's experiences were different, which reflected or was reflected in a different kind of knowledge, and that knowledge was more valued. Women's experiences, home and sometimes work, resulted in a bifurcated consciousness. This is somewhat like Du Bois' double consciousness, and a number of people discovered at the same time that there were two separate social worlds and two different modes of expressing this. So for women, this emerges from the split and the contradictions experienced in moving between domestic and public spheres. So many women began writing about this and researching on this. Now, I did a number of papers with students. The one in particular that was exceptional with the student, we analyzed, the student was exceptional. We analyzed impressionist works from male and female painters, Degas and Renoir and Morisot and Cossette. And we showed in that paper how they had different choice of subjects, different context, and different activities reflected in their actual works of art. So in this world of the bifurcated consciousness noted by Dorothy Smith, women must juggle often contradictory realities, motherhood and paid work. And this is all developed by later feminists, the overwhelming burden of these two sets of responsibilities. All of this was amplified for women by COVID-19. So the upshot of second wave feminism, to a certain extent, was negotiating the halls of male power, successfully passing legislation, although we still are somewhat underrepresented in all of the legislative bodies. Building ties with other women across partisan political lines and getting legislation, as I said, building ties to get legislation passed, then giving voice to the everyday reality of balancing work, children, and family life that especially women encounter. So please don't forget to finish the quiz, the sociological review quiz. Participate in the discussions. We will move forward from here. I think this material will be very helpful to you as we begin to look at the classical theorist, and you can see from the very beginning that we will have to move beyond the definitions of class as defined by Marx and even by Weber and Durkheim.